Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights listening session on white supremacy, domestic threats, and youth extremism. I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items so you all know how to participate in tonight's event. If your first and last name are displayed, please click on the Participants button on the Zoom window, hover your mouse over your name in the participants list, and click on Rename. Please rename to your first name and the first letter of your last name, especially if you are a minor. Due to youth participation today, please remember that no minor under the age of 18 is permitted to speak during today's program without their parents' pre-submitted consent. So if you are speaking and you are under the age of 18, we are assuming you have the consent of your parents. If you have questions during any period during the program, please type your questions into the chat pane in the control panel. We will collect these and address them throughout the program, with similar questions being combined. Please note that inappropriate or offensive questions will not be announced. Also, automatic closed captioning is available to everybody on this program tonight. During the open forum, oral remarks will be limited to 2 minutes per person in the audience. As the host, we reserve the right within our discretion to mute and remove, if applicable, any individual who goes over the allotted time or who uses profanity or derogatory or offensive language. Due to the time constraint tonight, please keep all questions on topic. If you experience any technical difficulties tonight, please explain your problem through the chat feature, and we will try our best to address the issue. At any time during the program, if you need to virtually step away due to the contents being discussed, a mental health professional is available in a safe space breakout room. Not to provide counseling, but resources will be available. To request to speak to a mental health professional during the program about available resources, please send a direct message to the host labeled as Matt Combs. Lastly, we are recording the panel discussion of today's presentation, and the video will be available on our YouTube page within 24 hours. Please subscribe to New Jersey OAG and Civil Rights NJ on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Flickr for the latest information on news, resources, and information from our office. Please follow DCR at Civil Rights NJ on Facebook and Twitter. Now, I'd like to hand things off to DCR's Director of Outreach and Community Relations, Dr. Danalorie Johnson-Fennell.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Tara, for the introduction, and welcome to all of the guests in the audience, in our virtual audience. I am Danalorie Johnson-Fennell, DCR's Director of Outreach and Community Relations, and on behalf of DCR and our Director, Rachel Weiner, it is a pleasure to be with you this evening. The New Jersey Division on Civil Rights is dedicated to ensuring the protection of people in New Jersey from discrimination and bias-based harassment in employment, housing, and places of public accommodation. Achieving full civil rights and eliminating discrimination is not only our goal, but it is our mission. We are partnered with stakeholders to implement 27 recommendations put forth by the Youth Bias Task Force. These were created in order to help us combat systemic and interpersonal biases among the state's young people. And I'm so glad to see that we have youth in our audience that are fully engaged and want to do this work. Tonight's event, as well as our upcoming listening session on July 14th, are resources that will help all of us to fully explore how we all can be catalysts for change. In 2019, more than half of known bias offenders in New Jersey were 25 years old or younger. 994 bias incidents were reported in New Jersey by law enforcement in 2019. That is the largest number since the state began reporting this data more than 25 years ago, and the recent numbers have increased. Bias not only impacts the victim's physical, emotional, and mental health, but it impacts our entire community. The recommendations set forth by the New Jersey Interagency Task Force to combat youth bias That report focuses on the future of our young people. It outlines how we can all work together as a more equitable and just society, but also it's supported by Governor Murphy under Executive Order 188. As we implement these recommendations, we're focused on white supremacy specifically tonight, and we are actively listening to our community participants that have a seat at this virtual table. DCR knows that acknowledging accountability matters. DCR knows that we need to be committed and we cannot be performative. It must be more than a promise. And the first of these many steps towards anti-racist work is acknowledgement. Thus, we begin by an acknowledgement of the history of the land that we call New Jersey. New Jersey was originally the land of the Lenape Indian tribe. And it's important that we say this because hundreds of years later, New Jersey was the last northern state to abolish the institution of slavery in 1804. And even today, New Jersey has the worst racial disparities between Black and white people when it comes to issues such as incarceration rates for adults and youth, when it comes to issues such as maternal child health and our fetal syndromes, when it comes to Nurture New Jersey, which we are so proud to have First Lady Tammy Murphy and her support, when it comes to general health outcomes, as well as wealth and wage gaps. All of these things impact our youth. All of these things can be steeped in racism, and all of these things matter when we talk about white supremacy. At one point, New Jersey had the fourth highest number of hate groups in the country, and all of that impacts mental health and well-being. And so it is important for you, if you need to step away and go into one of our safe spaces, please do feel free to utilize those as instructed in those opening ground rules and housekeeping. Another element that we want to quickly point out is related to anti-racism and assessment. Earlier this year, DCR celebrated our 75th anniversary of the law against discrimination. And when we did that, we recognized that New Jersey is one of the first state-level civil rights statutes to go into effect in the US after Reconstruction. But this year has also exposed two pandemics, not one, two. Of course, there's COVID-19, but there is this notion of systemic racism, which is real. Addressing these dual pandemics requires a third step, and that's action. DCR is fully committed to fighting racism and systemic injustice, and we're committed to doing the real work. And when I say the real work, I mean the real heart work, not hard work, the heart work. And that's important because the institutional and systemic work that we need to do really requires that we're all fully bought in, but also that we understand the issues around white supremacy, as well as domestic terrorism, extremists, youth recruitment, all of those things. And so tonight we will hear from subject matter experts, but we'll also talk to people that have been impacted by racism, and we're going to hear their stories. All of this is a part of the proactive arm of DCR, whether we're focused on our strategic initiatives, our programs, our events, community relations and outreach, public education and training. All of that allows us to be a better DCR, which allows for a better New Jersey. So on behalf of the OAG, DCR, the crew, our educators that are participating, our youth ambassadors, the commissioners, the community partners, panelists, participants, all of you, we welcome you to tonight's listening session. It is focused on white supremacy, domestic terrorism, radicalization, as well as youth extremists. We'll go into detail about what that really matters, why that really matters, but what's really important for us is for you to know that we're not really here to just listen to those experts that you'll see on the panel. Of course, we love them, we want to hear that, but we want to hear from you. So you'll have an opportunity to drop questions in the chat. You'll have an opportunity to raise your hand. You'll have an opportunity to send us questions and share your story around how white supremacy has impacted you and or your community, either as a bystander or an upstander. At this point, it is so much of an honor for me to say that we have with us lead New Jersey fellow and chief executive officer for the Girl Scouts Heart of New Jersey, Natasha Hemmings. Natasha is the first African-American woman in the council's history to lead the organization. And I'm just so proud of her as a mom, a longtime advocate, a sister Greek, a woman that's focused on girl empowerment and leadership. Natasha plays a critical role in sharing the inspirational stories of Girl Scouts across the state, inspiring our students and our families of all cultures. And she has a deep passion for community issues pertaining to women, girls, diversity, and inclusion. And in unity, we're going to hear about white supremacy in this listening session, but we will also be dropping in the chat DCR resources as well as definitions that can also be found on our website. As a reminder, this is a safe and brave breakout space. If you need that, please take advantage of it. And those safe space details will also be placed in the chat. At this time, Natasha Hemmings, it is my pleasure to pass this virtual mic to you and have you set the stage and bring greetings from you as well as from our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. D. I got the privilege of being able to call Dr. Danalorie my sister in Greekdom, and I'm so blessed to be here. I want to thank Dr. Danalorie Johnson-Fennell, who you all just met, and to thank the New Jersey Division of Civil Rights for inviting me to moderate this panel discussion and community listening session on such a serious topic of white supremacy, domestic threats, anti-racism, youth, social justice, and youth extremism. I also would be remiss if at the top half of this, I did not also thank Rachel Weiner, the director of the New Jersey Division of Civil Rights. It is my pleasure to be here, and we are going to dig in. We are here to engage with all of you, our youth, parents, educators, and members of the public, really. I see that there are over 70 people here for this conversation tonight, and that is heartwarming for me as a leader with youth in the state of New Jersey, that so many of us want to come together and share our stories and to figure out some strategies for us to fight racism and hate here in the state and to be stewards of support for our youth. As Danalorie said, tonight's discussion is the first of 2 listening sessions. So I hope that we will see you all again and that you will bring a friend for the July 14th session. That will follow. There will be some in the chat. I'm sure that the DCR comms group is going to be dropping in all kinds of nuggets of information and resources. So I want to make sure that all of you are keyed in there. Now, tonight we have several key program objectives that we are going to drop in the chat for you, but I want to start off with the one that I thought to myself was the most important, which is there will be active listening, not passive listening tonight, but active listening, because we will be engaging with our community around their white supremacy experiences, youth extremists, and hate group linked experiences. There will be active listening all night tonight until we close at 8:30. There will also be an objective of awareness of white supremacy. So not just saying the words, but defining it, knowing how we can combat issues that come up with white supremacy, and what are the tactics that hate groups use related to youth when they recruit. We also want to make sure that the traumatic impact on youth that are harmed by white supremacy, that we shine a spotlight on that tonight and do an overview of adverse childhood experiences that come out of those experiences. And then finally, 2 other things. We want to understand the overall effects of white supremacy on communities and resources that are available to protect ourselves and our community. It's not just understanding of what's right, but what's being done in the state of New Jersey to protect our communities. And then finally, we have an anti-bias vision for the next generation, and we want to share that. What does no hate in this great state mean, that hashtag? I'm sure many of you have seen it. And what does civil rights mean in the division of civil rights to our youth ambassadors and to all of you? And we're also going to have a final objective to ask you to pledge to hashtag stop the hate and to stand against racism. So without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's subject matter experts, our panelists. Their bios are on the Division of Civil Rights website. That will also appear in the chat, a quick link to that. But our first subject matter expert is Stephen Cremando. He is a mental health professional, and he is the Director of Training and Disaster and Terrorism, a branch division of Mental Health and Addiction Services with the New Jersey Department of Human Services. So Stephen Cremando is going to talk with us during the panel, as well as he's going to be chairing along Mary McCord, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. She's also a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and she is an expert in unlawful militias and domestic terrorism, formerly of the Department of Justice at NSD. Our third subject matter expert, who there's not enough goosebumps I'm getting now to hear from Frank Meeink. He is a former white supremacist from South Philly, and we'll hear a little bit about his story and how he got involved in the white supremacy movement. Our fourth panelist is John Lewis, a New Jersey native who holds a master's in Homeland Security Policy from Rider University. He's one of our own. He's a research fellow of the GWU program on extremism. So he's going to be able to share with us information, not just from the Homeland Security Policy angle, but also as a research fellow, having done this research with George Washington University. Our fifth panelist is Jenny Prezwalla. She is the Director of Field Operations, acting Associate Director of Field Operations, Central Center for Prevention Programs, and Partnerships, also with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. We're also excited to hear from Oren Segal, the ADL Vice President of the Center on Extremism, Social Media, and he speaks to how digital platforms and spaces can enable hate and bias. So we'll be looking to hear what he has to say. And then finally, our last subject matter expert is Alexandria Poole, a college student from Rider University who has been bullied and harassed by white supremacists or related hate groups. And Alexandria is an upstander, and she will share her experience with us tonight on this panel. So with that, I'm going to do a time check, and we are going to dig in. We've asked our 7 panelists to use the first 5 minutes of their voices with us today to answer 2 preset questions. And to frame our discussion, we want them to answer those questions and to share their story, the work that they're doing, or connection to this topic of white supremacy. So with that, I will call on our first panelist, Stephen Cremando, and ask this question of Stephen. You ready, Stephen?
I think I am. Thank you.
Okay. What signs should parents or educators or others, family members, look for related to recruitment, bullying, harassment, and discrimination? And what does that online recruitment process look like?
Well, I'm going to start with the second half of your question and work backwards for a few moments. Online recruitment today happens in every domain of the internet sphere. It happens in online forums and chat rooms and boards. It happens in internet games, which may be multiplayer games, and people are communicating within the gaming system. It happens on social media networks. It happens even on the apps on our phones and our devices. So there's really not a place where recruiters and radicalizers don't tap our technologies and find a way to really reach out, especially to our younger people who've grown up in an environment with these devices. We also know that because people are using these devices, they're up sometimes 24 hours a day, and they're up and they're using these devices in places very often where they are alone, and no one else is really looking over their shoulder to notice what they're scrolling through and what they're tapping into. The process itself is very, very sophisticated. And in fact, in these digital environments, which I know other experts are speaking on this evening as well, it seems that the white supremacists and others in these extremist movements have actually learned a lot from the foreign terrorist organizations and the sort of propaganda they've used online for the last 2 decades and become very, very slick and very polished with. And we know at a deep technological level, some of these platforms actually use different algorithms which continually but gradually lead people deeper into these extreme belief systems. So they can happen very gradually. They can happen in these very subtle ways where the individual themselves, never mind their parents or loved ones or friends may even notice. And they can happen through very, very subtle forms of manipulation over time. But the first part of your question, I think, was very important, and especially the way you phrased it, which was about the behavioral indicators, because very often when people talk about what are the symbols of hate, what are the the graphics and the symbology and the different icons that we should look for, I think many people are in fact familiar with many of those signs, and they'll be discussed further this evening as well. But what's probably more striking are the behavioral changes. And that could be as general as a sudden dramatic change in someone's behavior, including changing their circle of friends, isolating themselves from friends or family, but starting to speak to others as if they're reading really a kind of a prepared script. They're taking on the language, they're taking on the perspective of someone else. And very often it comes across as being young or old as they are. So very often they're unwilling to discuss their views because they're actually, if they're in the radicalization process, not fully aware of the depth of some of the views. They're just taking these on in a surface way until they really get indoctrinated. So in the early parts of radicalization, people could be secretive. They could be protective about folks looking at their phones or their computers to see where they've been. And if we can see where they've been, very often we can see that they're accessing white supremacist materials online. That could be websites and readings. It could be videos and all kinds of material that really we start to see in their behavior and see in their interests, very, very specific, hateful racial terms, and very often incitement for violence. Sometimes the behavior does combine both symbols and the more, softer behaviors we're speaking of here, which means that someone might end up with a tattoo, might end up with a patch or a drawing on an item of clothing in which they actually are displaying some of the well-known symbols of the different white supremacist organizations. Or a younger person may even be involved in creative work where we see them drawing or sketching these things on school books or posters or even in graffiti. So to answer your question, it really comes back very directly to how you phrase this. The behavioral indicators probably are as important than anything else for all of us to be tuned into. And just to sum that up, when we see a sudden dramatic change in someone's behavior, it always means something. And it doesn't always mean something nefarious and dangerous, but means something. And the people who care about that individual, care about our safety and security, it's important that as upstanders, they do recognize that, ask what that's about, find out where that person is going.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. As a parent, I really appreciate hearing what those behavioral indicators are. So we're going to move on, Steve, to Mary McCord. Mary, are you there? And I'm going to ask Mary this question. What is white supremacy? I need you to define it for us in the context of youth radicalization.
Sure. So white supremacy, and I think I'll be very interested to hear others' views on this, because it probably is something that everyone thinks of just a little bit differently. But white supremacy is itself an ideology, right? It's an ideology based on the notion that the white race is a superior race, therefore the words itself, white supremacy. Now we know that institutions of our American culture have been built on notions of white supremacy, and that means our criminal justice system, that means other institutions like our financial institutions, our educational institutions, our housing institutions. There's a structural racism that was built into the way this country formed because of some of the unfortunate parts of its history. But what I really want to focus on right now for purposes, there's a lot of discussion about that just structural racism, and we should be having that discussion, is when white supremacy as an ideology becomes extremist, that extremism can lead to violence. And that is what is so terribly dangerous about any type of extremism. Now, let's be clear, extremism can be is not unique to just white supremacy. So it can be based on different types of ideologies. It can be anti-government extremism. It can be Islamist extremism. It can even be animal rights extremism. An ideology becomes extremist when those who believe in that ideology start to believe that it is acceptable not only to harass others, belittle others, discriminate against others based on their ideology, but in some cases actually to use violence against others or even against our institutions in furtherance of that ideology. So if we think about the most extreme example of that type of violence to intimidate and coerce based on ideology, the most extreme example we've seen in the United States is the 9/11 attack, which of course probably happened well before many of you on this call tonight were even born. But that was a terrorist attack on our country that was driven by Islamist extremism. More recently, we've seen multiple different types of violent attacks based on white supremacist extremism. So we've seen mass shootings down in El Paso, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, at the Baptist Church in Charleston. Some have been anti-Black, anti-Latino, anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. We've seen attacks against LGBTQ members of our communities and against people of all different other faiths and races. And when that attack is based on ideology, that is terrorism. Now, in the context of youth radicalization, youth are important to extremist movements. And I've seen that in my own career at the Department of Justice, particularly my last few years of my career there when I was working in the National Security Division, and we handled all of the counterterrorism cases. That meant we actually handled the prosecutions of people who committed terrorist acts. Again, regardless of what ideology was motivating those attacks. And what I saw when I was there is that the techniques, and this is something that we just heard a few minutes ago by the first panelist, is that the techniques of foreign terrorist groups like ISIS are very similar to some of the techniques we see used by extremist domestic groups like white supremacist groups. And there are many of them. And it's also the same tactics used by conspiracy theorists, right? You've probably heard about QAnon, that espouse false statements, just lies, and they spread those on the internet. It's used by accelerationists. That's a type of extremist that is trying to accelerate this country to another civil war in order to create a white ethno-state. It's in a very extreme form of white supremacy. We've seen militia violent extremists use similar techniques. These are groups of individuals who think that they have a right, which they don't under the Constitution, that they have a right to arm themselves collectively as a private militia and enforce their version of law against others. And that could mean showing up at racial justice protests in order to protect property against false rumors of Black Lives Matter violence. It could be physically assaulting other people or assaulting our democracy, like we saw on January 6th, when militias, conspiracy theorists, acceleration extremists, and white supremacist extremists all gathered together and violently overthrew our Capitol Police and violently entered the US Capitol to try to stop the counting of the Electoral College vote to certify the vote for President Biden and Vice President Harris. So what I've seen is that the foreign terrorist groups, as well as these domestic groups I've been talking about, they will use social media. We'll hear more about that. They will appeal particularly to the youth by using videos and memes and jokes that are racist, that are sexist, that are anti-LGBTQ, that are anti-Semitic. They'll use that to normalize that type of bigotry. And then eventually, because of the algorithms, which we'll also hear more about tonight, people who consume that type of content on social media will just be given more of that same content. And it doesn't take long, and I think some of our speakers will probably talk about this, for that content to get very dark and very violent. And that's when we worry about what I call the path of radicalization to violence. And I saw it the way ISIS reached out to our youth, sometimes people in high school, even in their younger siblings, to try to attract them to actually either travel to Syria to join this terrorist group that was taking people hostage, that was beheading people, that was doing atrocious things in the name of creating an Islamic State. I've seen them use social media to try to attract young people by lies, saying it was a utopia in Syria, that the Islamic State would be a beautiful utopia where people could live in harmony under their own law. But that just wasn't true. I similarly see social media again being used, reaching out to youth to try to, by white supremacist groups, to try to attract them to that ideology.
Wow.
And they will use any falsehood they can, including, and this was the last comment I'll make because I know we need to move on. Right now, there is a big and important discussion going on in this world about teaching our youth about white supremacy, teaching what's called critical race theory, which maybe some of the others will talk about. And that is being used by white supremacists to try to create a narrative that white children are victims because they're going to be taught what we know is the truth about our history, but what white supremacists want to keep hidden. And they don't want that, taught in our schools. So they're going to be using that narrative to try to reach out and try to lure youth, white youth in particular, but even youth of other races, to try to push back on that, to use that as a catalyst to recruit and propagandize and radicalize. And so these are the things we will
I was going to say that sounds like one of the tactics or next steps that we're going to have to talk about towards the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you,
Ms. McCord.
Thank you, Natasha.
We're now going to turn to someone who has lived in that space themselves, Frank Miink. I am just curious to what led you into neo-Nazism at such a young age. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then what conduct did your group engage in with the goal of intimidating or bullying or targeting communities of color? Can you speak to that for us, Frank? I'll say the questions again. What led you into neonatism at such a young age? And then what conduct did you or your group engage in with the goal of targeting and or intimidating communities of color?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. So, how did I get in? Not a great home life. And I know a lot of people don't come from a great home life and they don't turn out the way I did. But, my mom had me when she was young. And my dad wasn't around. We were on welfare as a kid. I remember being on food stamps and being embarrassed of that, going to the food stamps and got to pull food stamps out of the old booklet and rip them out. It was just embarrassing. And the hottest girl in my neighborhood always come in right behind me. You can't pull out food stamps in front of hot girls, and I just had this I was embarrassed of the way that we lived, but I knew that my mom was doing the best she could. And then she got remarried to a man who just was abusive, just hated my guts. I was a part of her old life, and I was part Italian, and he didn't like me for that. And he used to say he was going to try to beat the Italian out of me. So after about 3 or 4 years of living with a bully in my home every day, wishing to get hit by a car instead of going home every day, I finally got kicked out and moved in with my dad. My dad lives up in Southwest West Philly. So I moved up there. My dad has a bar where I don't ever see him. He has a little bar in the hood. And I went to an all black school that year. And I was a new kid in the middle of the school year. I was a white kid. I was a skater kid. I was an athlete. And I fist fought a lot. It just is what happened. And that rage I had from being beat at home, being neglected at home. Now I'm at school and I got to fist fight all these kids all the time. It's just building up in me. You know, it was so much fear. I was so full of fear that it finally turned to hate and rage of others. And I took it that those black kids that I was fist fighting with, I judged all black people wrong, you know? And so that's kind of what started it. I'll tell you real quick, I heard things I grew up and I used to hear jokes in my neighborhood like, oh, Johnny, I went to the store today and Johnny tried to Jew me. I never got the joke. I used to ask my uncle, what's that mean? And I remember one day my uncle tried to break the joke down to me he said something about Jews picking up pennies. And I said, what's that? Why is it so funny? And he goes, well, Frank, when you're older, you'll get the joke. It's actually a really funny joke. You'll get it when you're older though. When I first joined my first neo-Nazi movement, when these guys let me in, now these guys let me in just because I liked hanging out with them. And I was the younger guy of their group. And I was this little skater kid with a bunch of neo-Nazis. They were my cousin's friends. And they thought I was cool. And they asked me questions about what's it like growing up in Philly, because they were all from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So they would say to me, and this is no lie, they used to ask me, you really take the bus with black people every day? And I'm sure they didn't use the word black, but they would say, you take the bus with black people every day? I say, yeah, I could take the L train. If you switch that life around, those people seen Amish people every day. I never seen Amish people in my life. That's National Geographic stuff to me. And here are all these neo-Nazi that are not Amish, white kids up in Lancaster are allowing me to come around and they're asking me, what's my life like? What's it like being around black people? To me, my parents never asked me, how's life? How's school? How come you got a black eye today, Frank? They never asked me. These guys would ask me these questions. So I'll get back to the Jewish thing I started to buy into this. I get the black-white thing. I'm fist fight with these kids. You know, to me, that's the end of the world. But when I started to hear the things about Jewish people, I went to my first meeting. And like I told you, I didn't get the jokes when I was younger. And when I was at my first neo-Nazi meeting, I heard them talking about this secret cabal of Jewish people who secretly run the earth and the world. It's called Zog. It's changed now. The QAnon has changed. It used to be called Zog, Zionist Occupational Government. It's a secret cabal of Jewish people that ran the earth. And so when they started breaking down how these Jewish people steal money out of our Federal Reserve and give it to Israel to start the next world war, the joke unlocked. I get what my uncle was saying. I must be adult now. I must be an adult because I'm getting the jokes. I want to be adult. These adults in my life left me to fend for myself. And now this group is going to take me on and they're going to tell me. I used to go to Bible studies. And I'll tell you, when they would tell me these things, I would go to Bible studies, just like someone was talking about. I would go to Bible studies in Pennsylvania, not in southern, down south, in Pennsylvania. I would go to these Bible studies and learn that the Jews are the seed of Satan. And that they would tell me these big crazy stories about Eve and the serpent, and that, Cain is the first evil Jew on the planet. And I'm like, I was born and raised Irish Catholic. I never heard these stories before. So when I asked them why I'm holding a gun in my hand, why have I never heard these stories from Sister Mary Agnes and Father Wassel at my Catholic church? They say, because God chose you to know it now. He needs you to be the angel to ruin Sodom and Gomorrah.
Wow.
And America is Sodom and Gomorrah to them. So on that part, I bought in. I'm in. I'm 15 years old, 14 years old, got a big swastika tattooed on my neck. I'm in. And committed all types of atrocities. And I'm going to tell you, because a lot of it isn't against the Black community per se. Once you get into the neo-Nazi world, most of our violence is against the left and against other white people. Antifa. I went to prison for kidnapping an Antifa member because there's such a thorn in the side of neo-Nazism in America, just so everyone knows the truth. And so a lot of the violence is the political motivated. Now, is there activity between, some street gang stuff on some days? Yes. I'm not saying that there isn't racial fighting, but really a majority of the neo-Nazi fighting is politically motivated violence. And to really break it down, who they do charge and they go after more is Jewish people, because we are just trained that is the main enemy. So now I want to talk about today and what I do today real quick. I know we ain't got much time, but so I have helped, and all this stuff is in Rolling Stone magazine, just came out this week or this month. There are tons of neo-Nazi police, tons of them, people, tons of far-right extremist police. We have to stop playing with this. We need real, concrete police reform now. We do not need neo-Nazis pulling Black people over on the New Jersey Turnpike at night and pulling them out of their cars no more. It's done. And we need that done now. And their unions are hiding them. So my job today, I used to do interventions on neo-Nazis. I did it for 25 years. For any young people listening, I've been in this trenches of civil rights for 25 years since I got out in 1994. And I'm telling you that the intervention stuff is great. We need to get people to stop saying the N-word. Great. That's not what's hurting us right now. That what seriously is hurting us is this system that has mass incarceration, and the police union and lobbyists built that mass incarceration, people. And
I hope that we can get more.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I know that we have a couple of community questions that are going to be coming to you, Frank. So let's hope that we can circle back around to that, because that sounds like it is a great place to start the work that you're doing now in comparison to how you were raised in South Philly and the belief systems that you were indoctrinated into. So we'll come back around to that, Frank, but I got to get to John Lewis. Mr. Lewis, your question from me is what degree of overlap is there between white supremacist groups and anti-government groups like the 3%ers or the Boogaloo Boys or Proud Boys or others? What's the overlap? What degree of overlap is there?
Yeah, sure. It's an excellent question. First, let me start with, I think, January 6th, because I think when we look at the
it sounds like, it looks like.
Sorry about that. When you look at the landscape of domestic extremism in the far right, I think that it's really important through January 6th to see it not necessarily as a state of the field, but as a really good lens into kind of the trends that we've seen in the past few years of an evolution of hate, not just through these extreme movements like the neo-Nazi accelerationists that Mary talked about, but this mainstreaming of these ideologies and these narratives. And so through the program on extremism, we currently track every single case of an individual's charged federally for their alleged participation in the events January 6th. Over 470 as of today have been charged. And they're really, I think, two distinct buckets that are really helpful to kind of examine. The first really small bucket to really address your central question here is Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. Those are the two groups that we've seen that, again, as alleged by the government, because none have pleaded guilty as of today, that were not only at the Capitol, but who engaged in pre-planning to disrupt the certification of the election, who planned, again, as alleged by the government, had firearms in Arlington, Virginia, preparing for a second group to go in, planned, how they were going to breach, were communicating in real time, where, you see the videos and images of Dominic Prezwalla, who allegedly, stole the riot shield and smashed through the window. You see the images of the Oath Keepers moving up in a military stack up the steps of the Capitol. And again, this was, again, as charged, there's, no more than 30, 45 total between those two groups who have been charged out of, again, over 470, 480. But again, a very potent kind of vanguard. And again, these aren't groups that traditionally coordinate or traditionally work together or anything like that. But I think what it shows and what it really is indicative of is a shared grievance and a shared common enemy. And with this, the second much bigger group, what you look at is inspired believers, right? Is kind of what we were calling it for our kind of internal shorthand here. Is a range of individuals from a hardcore QAnon believer to a 3%er from New Jersey, to a mother and a son, to a brother and a sister. Like, you have every combination of friends and family and a boyfriend and girlfriend, and all these people who, for some distinct set of reasons that are obviously deeply personal to them, but again can largely be broken down to a desire stemming from false narratives to disrupt the certification of an election that they, again, falsely viewed was stolen. And so when you kind of look at this and take a step back and you look at the rise in right-wing extremism, which really, you can really break down is domestic violent extremism, either racially, ethnically motivated, which is, white supremacy. So, Proud Boys, and then, neo-Nazi white supremacist movements and groups like Atomwaffen Division, like the Base, which had a New Jersey member who was arrested for directing an individual in Michigan to deface synagogues. You see the rise of these groups, both offline and offline, not necessarily working together, but enjoying and benefiting from this mainstreaming of hate, this mainstreaming of conspiracy theories. You look at 2020, I think, as really a landmark for three kind of central motivators for many of these groups. First, obviously, COVID-19, right? You saw everything from anti-lockdown stuff to anti-vax stuff, which motivated a wide range of actors from the QAnon side of things to more hardcore extremists like the Boogaloo movement. The next, obviously, the murder of George Floyd and the response to subsequent racial justice protests, which galvanized a wide range of white supremacists and anti-government extremists to act and seek out violence, or in many of these cases of the accelerationists, again, that Mary spoke about, are individuals who are seeking to take advantage of unrest, to take advantage of situations where there is a situation where there is the potential for violence. They are hoping to accelerate that, to either bring about violence against law enforcement, against minorities, against protesters, to create this volatile situation through which they can then enact their goals, whether it's a civil war for a white ethno-state, whether it's a collapse of government for, to return us to some twisted ideal of 1776. This doesn't exist in a vacuum. These are all movements that, while not necessarily working together, are undoubtedly pushing towards goals that are made possible by these conspiracies, by these narratives. And obviously, just to close on that, the narrative of this stolen election is something that we continue to see galvanize, far too many mainstream, individuals, and the propagation of this conspiracy theories is clearly something that is motivating white supremacists, anti-government extremists.
Yes, it definitely is adding to the propaganda. I mean, we're seeing it on several news streams almost daily now, having to do with the election. So thank you for that, John. I want to move on because I have a pressing question for Jenny Prezwalla. And Jenny, I wanted to throw out to you, what can parents and educators and other students do when they witness white supremacist activity, or if they're threatened in their school or community? What are some real things that they can do, parents, educators, or other students?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me, Natasha. I was a Girl Scout for 7 years, so I very much admire what you do and the work of the Girl Scouts. So first of all, coming here from DHS, we do want to affirm that DHS has released multiple reports saying that violent white supremacists are the most lethal of the domestic violent extremist movement. So we are very concerned. We also released a bulletin right after January 6th that we expect the violence from both white supremacists, militia, QAnon, and others that were present on January 6th, we expect that that type of violence, unfortunately, to continue throughout 2021, at least the threat of that violence. And white supremacy has been a persistent problem really since the founding of our country, but we have seen an increase in activity and in violence in just the past 5 years that we're very concerned about. Now, that's the bleak side. The positive side of this is that bystanders, including teachers, parents, and youth, are very powerful, and they have the opportunity to really help prevent a lot of these attacks. Even what we saw on January 6th is that family members of the attackers said, I had been concerned about my loved one for years, but it wasn't something I wanted to call law enforcement about. I wanted to get them some other type of help, but I didn't know how to do that. So first, what we would say is that if you are a bystander in a situation, you see a fellow student in school, or you're a teacher and you have a student that is writing, for instance, a term paper praising white supremacy, showing some of those signs that Mr. Cremando outlined earlier, that if you see these concerning behavior changes, that you don't worry alone. Many times what we've seen in these situations is when bystanders see these behaviors, they want to distance themselves from that person. They want to not engage. They want to step away. They want to assume this is just a phase, they'll get over it. This is just a high school teenage phase. And what we want to say is that we've seen that it's not. We heard from the former white supremacists talking about how powerful that ideology was.
Right.
And even more than that, how powerful that group was in providing him a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose when he didn't have it in his life. And so it isn't just a phase. And, you know, when you see some of these concerning behaviors like hatred towards immigrants, towards people of color, towards the LGBTQIA plus community, don't ignore it. And if you are a student or a peer of a young person, please tell a trusted adult at the very least. Often you can also report these things if your school does have a school reporting mechanism for school safety. You can report it through there. And if you're a teacher or a school administrator, please do reach out to your fellow administrators, to your school safety team to figure out a plan. Now, the plan that we recommend in this case, most of the time it's not going to be a law enforcement matter, right? What we've heard from the former on this video call, and thank you for participating, is that there's often with him and with others, a number of what public health workers call risk factors, or hard things that have happened to that person in their life that set them up to be more at risk for committing an act of violence or for becoming engaged in some type of other societal problem like drugs abuse and substance abuse. So what those people need is help. And so when you reach out, think about it as if I'm not going to get my friend in trouble. I'm going to reach out and get help from my school safety team, from a trusted adult for this person because they're suffering likely in some way and they need that assistance. What I would say is, please, if you are a school on this call or an institution that is interested in setting up those intervention mechanisms and getting this more in-depth training on violent extremism, white supremacy, and how to do intervention, please reach out to my counterpart who is there, Ray Basogno, in New Jersey. He works with a lot of the partners on this call to ensure that we have those mechanisms set up so that when we see this, as people in our communities, we know what to do. We know to not ignore it, and we know where to call to get help for these people that we are concerned about.
Jenny, I love the idea of not just taking it as a sign of you're going to get your friend or your colleague in trouble,
Exactly.
but that you're getting them help. You're getting them help, being of help. That's a really important takeaway that I hope the youth and parents and educators who are on this call take away from your remarks today. I have one more panelist that I want to get to, or subject matter expert, and that's Oren Segal. Oren, I'd love for you to talk to us about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-immigrant. Jenny mentioned that just now, but the beliefs in the ideology of white extremist groups.
Sure. Nice to meet you, Natasha. Thanks for having me. I do very much appreciate everybody taking the time to join this discussion today. It's not the happiest of topics. I mean, let's just be honest, but I really believe it's not all doom and gloom, in part because of the great work that folks like yourself are doing, and certainly what my co-panelists are doing every single day. I want to note that, you can't really do this type of work, pushing back against extremism and hate, without having a healthy dose of optimism, actually. And so it's almost like America itself, right? It's not what it is right now, but it is what it could be. And getting to that sort of better place requires a commitment to engage. And so again, for all those who are engaging today, I certainly appreciate that. In terms of sort of the fundamental ideologies of white supremacy, no matter what the variation is, no matter sort of what subset of groups we're talking about, people have probably heard references to alt-right or neo-Nazi or Klan, right? There's sort of a range of sort of white supremacist beliefs in a sense, but they have things in common, right? This notion that the white race itself is going to be and is threatened with imminent extinction, right? It's doomed unless white people are willing to take action. And it's doomed by this rising tide of color. People like immigrants, people of other religions, brown people, and they're being manipulated specifically by the Jews. And so white supremacy in terms of extremist movements has moved away from simply maintaining power in this country to actually fighting for what they believe is their actual ability to exist at all. And when you are fighting for, your existence as opposed to maintaining power, that adds a level of militancy, right? You'll kind of do whatever you need to do to maintain control or defend your culture or your people. And this is, of course, how they see it. So they promote this concept of white genocide, and they promote that as an effort to wake up other white people to the ostensible sort of threat from non-whites. And so one of the more popular slogans among white supremacists is called the 14 words. And so you'll see a lot of tattoos will have 14 on it. Or actually literally spelled out the 14 words. And what it stands for is, I kind of hate to say it, but again, we need to sort of understand what they're talking about. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, right? And that again sort of speaks to this level of imminent extinction at the hands of non-whites. Another way that this has come up recently is through this concept of the Great Replacement. This is a theory that came out in France 10 years ago, a French author, and basically focused on Muslim immigration into European countries and how that was going to marginalize sort of European history, European heritage, and basically white culture. Well, American white supremacists have put a bit of a twist on that. And this is really, really important because these ideas, the 14 words, the Great Replacement, have led to a lot of the violence that we have seen against communities of color, religious communities at the hands of white supremacists. And I think one particular example that speaks to not only the ideology of white supremacy, but I will say reinforces the mission of the Anti-Defamation League, which is to combat injustice against the Jewish people and secure justice for all. Here's what I mean by that. The way that you fight racism, xenophobia, misogyny, anti-LGBTQ, et cetera, forms of hatred is to fight anti-Semitism. And the way to fight anti-Semitism is to fight all those other forms of hatred. And so for white supremacists, the reason they prove that tactic to be true is when you look at what happened in Pittsburgh, right, at a synagogue, the deadliest attack against the Jewish community in American history, 11 people were killed. Here's an individual who's animated by white supremacist ideas, but very specifically the immigrant community, right? Here's somebody who thinks, a bunch of caravans are coming from Mexico to replace the white people here in America, to take their jobs, take away their livelihood, hated the fact that immigrants were coming into this country, viewed it as the Browning of America, and then killed 11 Jewish people. Because in his ideology, the Jews are manipulating other races. The Jews are the ones who are responsible, right, for immigration, multiculturalism, feminism, diversity, all these things that I think many of us on this call view as the potential of this country, but that white supremacists view as a direct threat to their very existence. And so that's where the connection between anti-Latinx, racist, anti-Semitism, these extremists have a very specific hatred for all these communities, but it's a reminder to all of us that if we are allies, right, if communities work together to push back against the efforts to drive wedges within these communities between white supremacists, we're going to be stronger and better equipped to push back against white supremacy.
And stronger together is what tonight's discussion and the start of the discussion is all about. Thank you for that. We have a young person on our panel, Alexandria Poole, who has had experience with being bullied or harassed by hate groups. And we wanted to give her the opportunity as the last panelist before we go into the open discussion, and before I introduce Rachel Weiner-Abner. We wanted to give her the last word here in a few minutes to talk about her experience. So Alexandria?
Sorry, I had a problem with the mute. Hi. So the situation that had occurred most recently for me, it occurred with my sorority earlier in the month of February 10th to be exact. My sorority was doing a partnered on campus, and it was based around women and sisterhood and solidarity amongst women as a whole. And when we got to begin our program, when we started our program, we were met with a barrage of about, I'll say 6 to 10 different people who genitalia, the N-word, and they also continuously said racial slurs and stereotypes and derogatory terms to us. So our program had to be immediately canceled because it wasn't a way to contain the chaos that was happening. So we had to immediately cancel our program and reschedule. Because of the way that the people came on to our Zoom, they had encrypted emails, they were all anonymous, and we know how easy it is to be anonymous over social media or over the internet. And so although a police report was filed, nothing really came of it. We didn't know if they were students, we didn't know if they weren't students, we didn't know anything basically. And nothing too much came from the investigation looking into them. However, our institution, they came and said that they were behind us and they were in support of us and all these things that they were doing. But because me, as well as my line sister, said that nothing would come from that exact situation, I feel as though we used it as a platform, not only to call out our own institution on some of the things that we felt like they could have done better in support of us. We felt like it was very easy for our institution to come behind us when things made the news, and when something became a bigger than usual problem. It was very easy for them to come behind us and say that they were in support of us. However, there are many times in everyday life and private here at the university that we don't feel supported by them and we don't feel like they're behind us. And so they allowed us to have a forum and a conversation with them, and me as well as my line sister used the time to kind of call out our institution on the things that we don't see them doing on a consistent. I've never had a Black professor in my major. I've had professors say derogatory things, well, microaggressive things to me as a science major. And we called out how they don't have any sensitivity training, or if they do have it, it's optional. And then so many people don't even attend. And we feel like although we started a conversation, we know that we need to start demanding more actions behind these institutions that claim to have our back in public, but allow things to slide in private.
And your institution, sorry, Alexandria, your institution is here in New Jersey.
Yes, Rider University, Lawrenceville to be exact. And so, although we started a conversation, like I said, but we want to continue to make sure that we're not just settling for a conversation and settling for the crumbs of a conversation that they'll give us and say that we should just be grateful just because they allowed us to talk about it. But we should be demanding equality and respect on a regular basis. If they want us to come here and prove that they're a diverse institution, they should be allowing us to feel supported at all times. Absolutely.
Thank you. And keep pushing on with that. You, your line sisters, your other Greeks there in Lawrenceville at Rider University, keep pushing, because that's when real change happens. It happens from within, and it happens from the voice of students like yourself. So thank you for being here and sharing that real life experience with us this evening. I want to move on to open up the mic and camera to my colleague, and the woman who, she really needs no introduction. I'm sure if you Googled her, you would come up with pages upon pages of very impactful information about who Rachel Weiner Apter is. So on behalf of this group putting this on tonight, they all work for her and with her. I want to introduce the director of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, Rachel Weiner Apter.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was incredibly kind. And I am so glad that you all have gotten to meet so many incredible members of the DCR team, including Dr. Danalorie Johnson-Fennell, who you can all tell is beyond words, really. I really just wanted to say thank you to all of you for participating. The number of new insights that I just learned in the past hour and 15 minutes is incredible. And I spend a lot of my life thinking about these issues. And I really just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Steve and Mary and Frank and Jonathan and Jenny and Oren and Alexandria. We benefit so much from your knowledge, but also from your passion and creativity and vision for making the future different than today. And so we're really grateful for your sharing, again, not only your details and statistics and information, but also passion and insight into how we can all do better and do more. And I'm really excited to hear all of the rest of the questions that we get tonight. So thank you to everyone. And of course, thank you to all community members. We are so happy to have you here and cannot wait for you to be able to participate as well.